Once again, I'd like to welcome everybody to this month's Wildlife for Lunch webinar. Today we're going to be talking about what bucks do during the rut. This presentation is presented by Dr. David Hewitt. He is the Stewart Stedman Chair for Whitetail Deer Research, the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute. Today's Wildlife for Lunch is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Dr. Hewitt, with that, I'll pass the controls over to you, and you should be good to go.
All right. Thank you, Clint. So welcome, everybody. And as Clint mentioned, what we're going to talk about today is something that's kind of timely, given that we're just coming off the rut, at least here in South Texas, and those of you further north have been away from the rut for maybe a month or so. But it's a neat time of year, and they're starting to learn some things about what these bucks are up to and what they're having to deal with during the rut. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge a couple of people. This type of research takes a lot of support and collaboration, and I'm going to be kind of the mouthpiece for this research day, but Aaron Foley, the second person listed on the title slide here, is the person that really did a great deal of this work as part of his graduate work here at Texas A&M Kingsville. And there's a number of supporters, funding agencies that help make all this research possible as well. So they're listed here, and we appreciate all their support. So the rut's a special time, and if you're able to hunt during the rut, it's just a real magical time to be out. And part of the reason is because you can throw your binoculars up and see deer in places where you maybe hadn't seen them before. You might be some deer that you're familiar with, but but they're showing up in the middle of the day, far away from where you're used to seeing them. And the deer's behavior is changed pretty dramatically, and obviously it's changed because these deer have a very different focus than they do during most of the year, and that focus is on finding does to breed. And the whole reason that the deer go through all this is kind of in preparation of about a 200-day, kind of a 200-day long gestation that's going to get fawns on the ground in summer. And so having a big pregnant doe like this during the summer is going to be the buck's ultimate goal. And that's what they're focused on getting done. They're real frantic about this, real focused, and one of the big reasons is because of I'm trying to get some of the tools working here. The real concentrated time when the rut is going to occur. These are some data from down near Kingsville, and show that the bulk of the conceptions are in about a 3-week period in early and mid-December. And so any buck that isn't real focused and even frantic about his breeding activities, if he sits out that 2 or 3 week period or doesn't give it his all during that time, he's not going to sire any fawns, and he won't have any of his offspring in the population in the future. And the only ones that are going to be there in the future are going to be those ones that were sired by bucks that worked real hard during the rut. So it makes sense why they're investing so much. The breeding strategy of the bucks, at least what we've known kind of to date, is that these bucks will wander around till they find a doe. They'll tend her, meaning they'll stay with her and maybe even defend her against other bucks, breed her, and then they'll repeat that. One of the first stages in this process of finding and breeding a doe is of interest to us, and that's what I'm going to be kind of focusing part of my talk on today. How do bucks go about finding these does? Whitetail bucks have some special challenges. They're not like, say, a pronghorn buck in the panhandle that can see over hundreds or thousands of acres and find pronghorn does readily. These whitetail does are not highly visible. The cover that whitetails use usually limits visibility quite a bit, and so there's going to have to be some moving and searching to find them. Whitetail buck also has a challenge in that the does aren't in large groups. They're not going to be like maybe a bull elk could herd a whole bunch of cows together and have 20 or 30 or more cows all in a group. These does are spread out in small social groups throughout this brushy habitat, and so the bucks are going to have to spend time to try to find these small social groups. And the doe's home ranges are relatively small, so these does aren't moving around a whole bunch. And that could be both a drawback, and it may also be a benefit. And I think you'll see here in a minute why that may actually help these bucks in finding does. So some of the previous literature on white-tailed deer breeding behavior has suggested that these bucks wander widely in search of does, and that's about all that anybody knew. And it just seems kind of hard to believe that there wouldn't be a better way of having of bucks finding these does. So that's what our study was done, is to see if there's a method to the madness of these buck movements during the rut. Our study occurred down in South Texas, down on the Laurellis division of the King Ranch. And we used the helicopter capture technique to capture a whole bunch of bucks over about a 5-year period in this area. Aaron Foley's the person on the left there, and he's the one who did all this work. Started in 2005 with a relatively small number of deer, and then moved, increased our sample sizes, and over the next 4 years had up to 30 deer collared in any 1 year. So we've got over 100 bucks in this data set right now, and that's what I'll be talking about. Every one of these bucks, we aged it and did some other measurements on them, fitted them with a GPS collar, like the one shown in the picture here. And this GPS collar recorded locations every 15 to 30 minutes from November to February. So we were getting a really good picture of what these bucks were doing before, during, and after the rut. So after the 5 years, we downloaded all our data. Had over 800,000 locations. Each of the colors on here is a different deer, so a lot of data is what all that shows. We then wanted to look at the buck movements and their behavior at different times during the rut. So we took those conception dates that I showed you earlier and divided them into periods of early, peak, late, and post-rut, 2-week periods basically. And one of the first things we wanted to look at was buck movements during these periods, and we also have some of our data from before the rut, so from late October, early November as well. And you can see that the bucks about double the number of miles per day that they move, from around 2 1/3 miles per day up to about 4 2/3 miles per day in peak rut, and then it drops off again after that. So one of the things the bucks are doing in their strategy to find does is they're moving around more, and that makes sense. Another thing that was interesting is that most of the bucks spent most of their time within their home range. Not every buck did this, but most of the bucks, about 80% of them, spent most of their time in their home range. But there were a few exceptions. One of these exceptions is that nearly all of the bucks made at least one, what I'm going to call an excursion, outside their home range. And the way we define an excursion is a movement, usually within about a 24-hour period, outside of the home range. And these are often a mile or two, maybe even more. And then within a day, they'd be back in their home range. And I'll show you a couple examples of those here in a minute. We had 7 bucks that did leave their initial home range, and they did not come back to it, so we classified them as dispersers. So those are bucks that did something quite a bit different. Had 5 bucks that had multiple home ranges, and then we had 6 bucks that we just called floaters. They really didn't seem to have a real defined home range at all. But about 80% of the bucks very much did have a home range, and really only left it for one of these excursions. So these excursions can be pretty extensive. Here's an example of one, a 3-year-old buck. The different colors of the points shown here in his home range are different months. Black is December. So you can see he made 2 great big trips. One of them was on December 1st, went over 18 miles in just over a day, went out, spent a few hours over here kind of to the west of his home range, and then made his way back home. And then 9 days later, took another jaunt out of his home range, spent some time down here to the kind of southwest of his home range, and then returned back home. Another buck, again, different colors or different months of this same buck. Green is December. This buck moved outside of his home range 4 times during the time we had him collared, and 3 of those times were during December. So again, almost all these bucks showed some of these excursion movements, these big movements outside of their home range, and those excursions were most common during December. So they probably have some rut function, but we're just not sure how that all ties together. Mentioned there were a couple bucks with multiple home ranges. This is an example of one of them. This buck started down here in the kind of southeast part of the map here, and in late December, 21st of December, he moved up and went up and spent a week or so up here, a little over 3 miles to the north. He moved back, spent 8 or 9 days there, back in where he'd started from, and then in early January, he went back north and spent the rest of the time that we followed him up north. So we classified him as having kind of multiple home ranges. He didn't just make one dispersal movement and stay there, but went back and forth between these 2 home ranges. So that's kind of the first step. We got these bucks moving more during the rut. Most of them are staying in their home range with the exception of these excursions. Now, what are they doing within their home ranges? And that's the next thing that we'll take a look at. We've got 2 options here. On the left-hand side is a buck's home range kind of outlined in green. And we've connected all the points together with what I'm going to refer to as kind of a little assessment corridor. That might be where the buck moved, and there's a kind of a width to that. And so we could add up all the space in those corridors and figure out how much of his total home range that he used. And that buck would use quite a bit of his overall home range because he moved throughout it. In contrast, over on the right-hand side, we have a buck that didn't use much of his home range. Again, he's got a green outline on his home range, and he's got some places that he visited repeatedly, and he's got a whole bunch of his home range, say kind of here in the middle, that he never really spent any time in to speak of. He may have passed through it, but just never spent much time there. So if we look at the home range sizes, and his overall home ranges are anywhere from 2,800 acres to about 2,000 acres, depending on what stage of the rut we're talking about. And then if we look at the amount of the area that the bucks kind of traversed, we do those assessment corridors. We're down around a quarter or a third of the total home range is what they actually visited. So most of these bucks weren't using their entire home range. They were just using portions of it. So they're much more similar to this example that we're seeing here on the slide. In other words, they've got some patches. They've got some areas that they're visiting, and they come back to those repeatedly. So this was pretty intriguing. It implied the bucks had some idea what they were doing and had some areas that they were really focusing on. So we had some kind of quantitative ways of figuring out where these patches are. If you look at this plot data here, you can see there's a couple areas highlighted in red there that the buck spent a lot of time. There's one little area up to the north there where he did spend a little bit of time, but not nearly as much as those other 2. And when we run this through some of our analysis programs, it makes a little kind of contour map. And the contours are related to the amount of time that a buck spent in a place. So this particular buck has 2 kind of patches or maybe focal areas that he used. And over to the left now is a buck that had 4 of these focal areas. So those are areas that these bucks are returning to and they're searching. The average number of these patches in any of these bucks' home range during the rut period varied from a little over 2 to almost 3 patches. And tended to be lowest during peak rut. 2.3 was the average number of patches during peak rut for any, the average number per buck. So what's going on with these patches now? Here's an example of a buck that has 2 patches. It's got patch 1 here, patch 2 here. They're about 0.8 of a mile apart. And then down below we did something kind of fun to get an idea how the deer was moving between these 2 patches. We plotted a 1 if the buck was in a patch, and we plotted a 0 if it wasn't in a patch, and then down along the x-axis here, the number of hours. So we followed this buck for, what would that be, 8 or 9 days, something like that. And the solid line here is patch 1. So the buck starts out up here in patch 1, Then he leaves patch 1, but he goes directly to patch 2. So now you can see the dotted line is patch 2. Now he's in patch 2, and he's just going back and forth between those, spending a few hours in each of those patches and then going and checking the next one. And then we get a period of time out here where that buck was in patch 1. He left patch 1, but he didn't show up in patch 2. He wasn't in either of these patches. He went somewhere else. And then 8 or 10 hours later, he shows back up in patch 1. So what was going on during that time? We don't know for sure, but you could envision that maybe he had found a doe. She wasn't in either of these patches now. He was tending her. Maybe the buck went on an excursion during that time. He was doing something different anyway. He wasn't visiting these patches. And that would be an intriguing thing for us to be able to follow up on eventually and determine what these bucks are doing when they're not visiting these focal areas or these patches. The other thing that was pretty interesting is there was a real strong pattern to how often the buck came back to these patches, these kind of focal areas, and it was centered right on 24 hours. They'd visit, come to one of these, spend some time there, maybe go to another patch or two, and about 24 hours later, they'd come back. And so they had a cycle, a pattern that they were coming back and visiting these patches about every 24 hours. So we're getting a little vision now of maybe what these bucks are doing during the rut in trying to find a doe. So they've got these does that are not highly visible. They're in small groups, but the doe's home ranges are relatively small, and that makes them predictable. So the buck can know where to go look and have a pretty good chance of finding a doe. And so what we're kind of theorizing, or what we think the bucks may be doing, is that these patches are where there's a social group of does, and they're coming back and visiting that area where those does are, and they're revisiting these patches about every 24 hours. And you might ask, well, why 24 hours? What's magical about that? Well, the doe's estrus, she's receptive for about a day or two. And you could see a buck, maybe there's a buck that visits these different patches every 6 hours. Well, things aren't going to be that much different every 6 hours. If a buck waited 3 or 4 days to visit a patch, he could very well miss a doe that's receptive. Had come into heat at that time and then gone back out of heat. But if you visit about every 24 hours, you're likely to find, come back into that area where that doe's hanging out and find that she's receptive then. So it looks like kind of a way maybe where these bucks are optimizing their search to find receptive does. One of the drawbacks of the work we've done so far is we just didn't have very many collared does at the time. But we did have one breeding season where we had 5 females wearing GPS collars. 3 of them were mature, 2 of them were yearling does. One of the yearling does dispersed off the area, so we really didn't have any data from her. The adult does all had a real defined home range. Just call it a single patch. They just had one area that they used. And so we looked at the distribution of our collared bucks relative to where these collared does were hanging out, and it actually matches up really well. Right here, highlighted in red now, there were 3 doe home ranges in there. We had 10 of our collared bucks that had a patch over that area. So they were visiting this area where these 3 collared does were, coming back about every 24 hours roughly. And then there was another female up here. She had 3 bucks that had a patch over the top of her home ranges. So they were visiting her area repeatedly as well. So some evidence that, that it really is does that these bucks are visiting at that time of year. And in all honesty, I really can't imagine what else these bucks would be investing so much time coming back and checking if it wasn't female deer. Another thing that was kind of interesting is if we look at during the peak rut in 2008, these are all each color on this graph represents the locations of a different buck. And you can see there's some places where these patches or focal points all overlap. Up here that I've highlighted in red now, there were 2 bucks that overlapped there. Here's a little area where 4 bucks had a patch that all overlapped. Down here in the south part is an area where there were 8 bucks that all came down and were visiting the same area repeatedly. So there's something there. There's some resource, and it's hard to believe it's just food or water or a resting place. During this time of year, it really makes sense that those are some places where there's does and those bucks are visiting those repeatedly. So you got these bucks looking for does. These does have some predictability because of their small home range. The bucks visit these areas repeatedly, find a receptive doe, they then tend her, keep an eye on her. That may involve just being vigilant, staying around and being with her. It may involve defending her against another buck, and the buck that finds her first may get displaced. There may be a more dominant buck that comes and takes over the job of tending and ultimately breeding that doe. But whoever's with her, someone's going to breed that doe eventually, and then those bucks go out and look for another receptive doe. So that's kind of the strategy that it kind of makes sense. There's some consequences to this for the bucks. And a lot of these consequences are kind of defined because this breeding season is so short. I said maybe 80% of the conceptions are about in a three or 4 week period. So any buck that, again, sits out those 3 or 4 weeks, he's not going to leave any offspring. And whatever behavioral traits he had, they're not going to be in the next generation. The only fawns that are going to be in the next generation are going to be sired by bucks that worked hard during this period. And so these bucks really focus on breeding, do that through increased movements, this vigilance and fighting and tending those does. And another thing that they do is they quit eating, or at least they don't eat nearly as much. And so we've got a situation where these bucks are increasing their expenditure, they're moving around more, they're reducing their intake, and as a result, as everybody who's ever seen bucks, particularly at the end of the rut, know they lose weight over the course of this. And that's kind of the last thing I want to talk about is just what is it that these bucks are using that weight loss to support. And I hear a lot that, oh man, the bucks are running around, they're burning up all their energy, and that very well may be. It may be this movement that's really it's really the cost and the reason the bucks need to acquire a lot of fat to be able to run around. And the changes in these bucks over the rut are dramatic. Here's some photos from late August of a buck. Looks like a butterball, big fat guy. Here's the same buck in mid-February now. And if it wasn't for antler characteristics, in fact, he even broke a tine off, but if it wasn't for that and other distinctive marks, you really wouldn't know that that's the same animal at all. In fact, you could almost think it was a different species. They look so dramatically different before and after the rut. So the bucks begin the preparation for this 3-week, real push on breeding. You might argue even in March or April when they begin to grow their antlers. Where they really start investing pretty heavily in getting ready for the rut is in late summer, August, and through September and October is really when they begin to put this fat on and start really getting ready for the rut. And so by the time you get to late September and into October, you start having these bucks again that look like a butterball. They put on a tremendous amount of fat. So what are they using this fat for? Are they using it to increase their movement and do all this running around, or are they using it to reduce the amount of time that they need to spend foraging? And what I'm going to show you are just kind of some back of the envelope calculations using some of our data from our research down here and some what we know about how much it costs for a buck to be moving around, and then how much energy would be released from the amount of fat that buck is losing, the amount of and where that energy is likely going. So to start this, most of the bucks that we caught on Aaron Foley's study, on that buck movement study, we not only measured their age and antler size and things like that, but we also used an ultrasound to measure how thick the fat on the deer's rump was. And so here we've got an ultrasound machine on this deer's rump, and we can use that once we know how thick that fat is. There's a pretty good relationship between the thickness of that fat and the total amount of fat on the buck's body. Most of our mature bucks, and even down into the 2- and 3-year-old bucks, would have an inch or more fat. We had some that had 1.5 inches fat in late October on their rump. If we just assume that the average buck has about 1 inch of fat on its rump, that means that buck is 25% fat. So a 175-pound buck would have about 44 pounds of body fat before the rut. And then we know that bucks lose about 20% of their body mass, and we'll just say for our 175-pound buck, maybe that's 35 pounds during the rut. And depending on the mix of protein and fat that represents, it could be at least 110,000 kilocalories is going to be the amount of energy released by that weight loss that the buck experiences during the rut. So is all this energy that that buck accumulated during September and October, maybe into November, is it being used to support all the additional movement that the buck does, or is it being used to enable that buck not to spend time eating? So that's a little question we're gonna try to answer here. And if we go back to our buck movement data, we can see that again the bucks moved around about 2 1/3 miles more per day than they had before the rut. And so the question is now we're going to assume that's all movement based with based on the rut, and how much energy does that take? So there's some equations that have been worked out to know the amount of energy that an animal spends while it's running around. And once we go through this, the bottom line is to go an extra 2 1/3 miles every day, which is what these bucks are doing. It takes about 192 kilocalories per day to support that additional movement. So we've got 110 kilocalories during a 6-week rut. If we divide that by 42 days, we get a little over 2,600 kilocalories per day that buck has available to use for something from the fat and protein that it's losing each day. We've only got about 192 calories per day that buck needs for the movement. So what that means is there's about 2,400 calories a day that the buck isn't consuming, but that it's being able to use to support its body, its metabolism and movement and all that stuff. So over 90% of the energy that is released from these body stores is being able, the buck can use it not for the additional movement and running around, but to keep it from having to spend a lot of time eating. And we figured out, using some other data, about how much time this might represent. And again, this is kind of back of the envelope type calculations, but if we figure that there's about 2,400 kilocalories per day that the buck doesn't need to consume, and we've got some data on how fast deer in the fall consume energy, so about 6 kilocalories of metabolizable energy per day, or per minute. If we do the division on that, it comes up indicating that the buck saves itself about 6 3/4 hours per day of foraging. In other words, a buck that didn't lose a lot of weight during the rut would have to spend over 6 hours a day eating. Now you can imagine what that does to this buck strategy. If it had to spend 6 hours a day eating, it's not going to be out looking for does in those 6 hours. It's not going to be able to tend a doe during those 6 hours. And while it's eating, there's going to be other bucks that maybe forego eating, and they're going to be the ones finding these does and tending these does, and they're going to be the successful breeders. So that's what we think's going on, is that a lot of that body weight loss is because the bucks change their focus from eating to breeding, which makes a lot of sense at that time of the year. So bucks have a strategy to find does, it appears. This weight loss is being used to support movement, but it especially enables the bucks to spend less time eating. And so we're going to predict that bucks with more fat are going to be the more successful breeders. And we haven't done any of that work, but that would be a really interesting kind of follow-up study to see if there's a tie between the amount of fat that a buck's able to accumulate in the autumn and how many fawns it sires relative to other bucks in the herd. So, I've got 2 things I want to finish up with. The first of these is just kind of a quick discussion on what does this all mean. I mean, some of this may be a little esoteric, about how the bucks are actually using their fat reserves and things like that. But I think there's some interesting things that come out of it from a management and a hunting perspective. And one of the first things that comes out of it is that for a buck to be a successful breeder, those reserves that it puts on in August, September, and October are going to be important. And so providing good food for the bucks during this time is going to be a big part of a kind of a strategy to enable those bucks to be successful during the rut and to not spend a lot of time just eating during the rut. Another implication is that a lot of people, when you start talking about the hunting season, and man, during the rut, these bucks that I had pattern, they're not showing up there. I got all these other bucks showing up, and it almost seems kind of chaotic, which is what makes it a lot of fun. And a lot of these buck movements seem to be kind of random, and to get kind of a different idea from this a little bit from the data that we've got here now. And one thing I think that comes about is that these bucks are their movements may appear random because they're not doing the same things that they were doing in August and September and October. So we put our game cameras up and we put them on bait piles, we put them on feed sites and things like that, and man, these bucks are coming in like clockwork. We got them patterned. This is gold. Well, those bucks during the rut now, all of a sudden food isn't their focus. And our data, with these buck movements and visiting these patches would suggest those bucks still have some very distinct things they're doing, but it's not food anymore. It's does, and looking for these does. And so these movements may appear random or very much changed, and they are, but the bucks still have a purpose and a strategy, it appears. Another thing that came out of our data is I presented the results as kind of this is what all bucks are doing. And I think you may have got a feel from some of the first slides where there's some bucks that are dispersing and there's some that are floaters and there's some that may have multiple home ranges. Not all the bucks are doing that. And so it's very clear that different bucks have different kind of strategies during the breeding season. Most of them do this kind of visiting these patches and moving from place to place to find receptive does. But not all bucks were doing that. And young bucks in particular really didn't invest a lot in traveling from one place, one focal point to the next. Those younger bucks seem to have some different strategies and maybe a little more kind of opportunistic and not as focused and organized maybe as moving from one place to the next. So there is still individual variation in a lot of this. Another thing is that some of these movements probably really are random during the rut. So these excursions that I talked about, we don't know what those animals are doing, and we can't predict where they're going to go. Can't predict when it is, other than these excursions seem to be more prominent during December. And so, when you're out hunting and you see this buck show up that you had never seen before, that buck may be on an excursion. You may never see him again, too. We predict that he's going to head back to his home range, and so some of those movements, may be kind of random. And then the tending as well. Once a buck finds a receptive doe, he's going to try to stay with her. And you'll see these bucks like this guy with his head down, and that doe may take off running, and that buck's going to follow her. He's going to try to stay with her. And some of those excursions, maybe these bucks out chasing these does, and these does take those bucks on a big run just to see how serious they are, and maybe try to get the most fit buck as the one that's going to breed her. So there's still a lot of things going on that we just don't know about. One final thing, maybe from a hunting standpoint, is that because 80% of our bucks spent almost all their time still within their home range during the rut, there's probably some value in patience. If you've seen a buck show up somewhere and it didn't show up, on this one hunt, maybe in the second hunt it didn't show up the same place, it's still likely that it's going to be coming by that same place eventually. Again, if this buck has 3 or 4 of these patches that it's visiting over the course of the rut, then it's likely to be coming back and visiting that spot as long as it was a place that you saw that buck during the rut. In other words, most of them just aren't picking up and totally abandoning their home ranges in the rut. And then another kind of management deal that most people are real familiar with and you hear it talked about a lot, but is providing some food for these bucks after the rut. All these deer, the bucks included, aren't going to put on a whole bunch of weight in late January, February, and even into March. They seem to do like a lot of the white-tailed deer further north do, is they're kind of hardwired to lose some weight over the winter and then stay a bit thin during the winter and then start putting weight on again in April and May and through the summer, and then especially in the fall. So having some food available is just a good option. High protein food probably doesn't make a lot of sense, again, because these bucks aren't going to build up a whole bunch of muscle mass again during the winter. But having some food with good digestible energy in it is probably what they need to kind of ride that out. And some of the food plot crops that are available for winter, those probably help and enable those bucks to get food in them pretty quick. So that'd be another implication, all that. And kind of the final implication of this is our time out in the field watching deer, is just so neat during the rut. There's all these other behaviors going on, and and I think that, at least I find this, some of this knowledge that I've shared today gives me a little better appreciation of what these bucks may be trying to do and what they're putting up with, and may help explain some observations like them not showing up at feeding sites nearly as often, and some of these other movements, why they may show up in places where we just hadn't seen them earlier in the year. So I think there's some enjoyment that comes out of knowing what these animals that we're hunting and managing are doing. All right, I told you there were two things. One of them was what I just went through, these kind of implications, I guess, and the last one is because I'm a faculty member and I have classes, and we all really like exams. So I'm going to have a little multiple choice test here, and you won't have an opportunity to share with me your answers, but you need to spend a little time, and we'll see how well you paid attention during the talk here. And it'll be multiple choice. I'm going to show you pictures of a couple of bucks, and you need to, at least in your mind, think about which one you think is going to be a successful breeder. So here's two bucks. We've got buck A and buck B, and you can look at those and kind of evaluate them and think, maybe these photos were taken in October. Which one of those would you predict is going to be a more successful breeder? And based on what I've shared with you today, I would hope you'd pick buck B because he looks like he's got a lot more body reserves, and he's going to have to spend a lot less time foraging and maybe have more energy for running around and finding does and doing all that. Okay, and here's a picture of a couple of other bucks. Got one pretty healthy looking buck on the left there hanging out on the beach, and we've got another buck on the right here that looks suspiciously like the person giving the presentation here. And based on what we've gone through, which one of those do you think is going to be a better breeder? And if you said buck A, you're probably right, but I will volunteer that I do have two wonderful kids, and so I at least have some breeding potential. And if you got those last two questions right, then you pass. And with that, Clint, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Hewitt. We only have one question that I see so far that has come in, so I will encourage everybody else. We've still got some time to get to questions. So the question that came in so far is, how wide is the home range? I think going back to some of your first slides that you had posted.
Right. So most of those are going to be a mile or two in width, and I need to go back and look for sure. But they're say if they're on average 2,000 acres, and if they were perfectly round, they'd be 1.5 miles or up to 2 miles. A lot of them are kind of elongated and have some different shapes, but that gives you kind of a general idea of the scale of these bucks home ranges during the rut.
Okay. As of right now, we don't have any more questions. I've got a few things to announce, but again, if you have questions, please post them up in the chat window. Looks like we may have had one pop in. Any questions?
Yeah, there's a couple that showed up here.
Like, to answer your question right now, it's not set to where you can see the other people who are watching the presentation. It's just a setting that was not selected when we set up the webinar program, so I apologize for that. How far will the bucks range? So there's kind of two answers to that. One of those is related back to the first question, is kind of how big is the home range, and again, a mile or 2 miles across might be kind of a typical home range. The other answer to that, though, might involve some of these excursions, which we don't think about in terms of the home range, and so these are these movements outside of the normal home range, and those can be anywhere from 1 mile or 2 out to 4 or 5 miles away from the home range. And that one buck, he made an 18-mile round trip, but he got out away from his really core home range, 5 or more miles. So in the right situation, some of these bucks on these excursions can cover quite a bit of area. Okay, looks like we've got a few more coming in now. Gentleman asked, there's a late season antlerless season in my county. Do I need to be concerned with bucks that are already shedding their antlers and making a mistake shooting a buck instead of a doe? Yeah, so without knowing when bucks shed in your area, it'd be a little hard to answer, but
down here in South Texas, the bucks will typically start shedding early March, and then by the end of March, just about all the bucks are done. And that's all after the hunting season. So down here in South Texas, that's not going to be a concern. Now, I know bucks in the hill country and other areas shed earlier, and I think what I would recommend doing in your area is, you know, if you can get out beforehand a little bit, get a sense of how many bucks have shed antlers, because you can see, if you get a little chance to look at them through their binoculars, if they have shed or not. Those, you know, those fresh spots where the antlers have fallen off are still pretty visible. And that would give you some basis to say, yeah, this is going to be a big concern, or, you know, on your initial kind of scouting trip, you see all the bucks that you saw still had their antlers, then you'd know, okay, it's probably not going to be a big concern, at least during that next hunt. So it's possible, and you just kind of have to evaluate that in each situation.
Okay. Next is, will a doe fawn breed her first winter, and how old does the deer have to be bred?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yes, deer can breed their first winter. A fawn can. So a doe fawn that's, say, you know, 5 to 6 months old, she can be bred, and that would mean that she'd have her first fawn when she hits her first birthday. Now that's a really valuable kind of population parameter to keep an eye on, because those doe fawns breeding is really sensitive to the nutritional conditions. And so if you've got really good range, you know, a lot of good food for these animals to eat, those doe fawns grow quick, there's a lot of energy and protein and nutrients for them, then those are the doe fawns that are likely to cycle and be bred. In most of South Texas, particularly where there isn't supplemental feed provided, you just about never see doe fawns get bred. You may go through 100 doe fawns and not find a pregnant one. And the reason is because the nutritional environment in South Texas in most years isn't real good for fast growth of these young deer. And so it's pretty rare for those doe fawns to breed. But in South Texas, if you know, the range conditions are exceptionally good, or supplemental feed is provided, then you can get up to about 30% of the doe fawns being bred. So that's a really good parameter to kind of keep an eye on if you do have a late season harvest and you're harvesting some doe fawns. I would really encourage you to take a look at their reproductive tracts. One thing that can make it a little bit tricky is a lot of times those doe fawns will breed later than the peak of the rut, and so they don't come into heat until, you know, a couple weeks or maybe a month later. And sometimes their fetuses are still pretty small, or even not quite visible yet during some of those late season harvests. So that'd be one thing that you'd want to get together with a biologist, and they can show you a couple other ways of determining if that doe fawn is pregnant or not.
Okay. In the study, did you notice any correlation between activity and moon phases?
We didn't, and I've seen Aaron Foley, the graduate student on the project, looked at that and didn't find anything. And I've seen some other, 2 or 3 other evaluations of that, and we're just not able to pick it up in, you know, in this type of GPS collar data. It doesn't mean that the bucks aren't doing something, you know, with different moon phases, but it just doesn't show up in the data that we get off these GPS collars.
Okay, the next one we have says, post-rut, I've seen bucks in bachelor groups in late December, and was wondering why they're in bachelor groups at this time of year, or is this just a coincidence?
Yeah, so some of it may depend on where you are. If you're in South Texas, that would still be, you know, peak rut time, particularly out in the western part of South Texas. If you're up in the hill country or some other places where the peak of the rut might be November, you know, late November, then by late December, a lot of that is probably tailing off, and I would say that would make sense, that they're starting to get back into some bachelor groups at that time. And, you know, a lot of that kind of antagonism that came with high testosterone levels and a lot of receptive does around, all those kind of triggers are gone, and so the bucks will start spending more time together. If you observe that in a place where, you know, where the rut was still going real heavy and there were still does to be bred, then you know, then it may be a coincidence that there were several bucks around in the same area feeding, or there was receptive does in the area, and that'll attract a lot of them. So depending on where you were, I guess that's what I'd interpret that observation as.
Okay. This one asks, it's kind of two parts. How big is a doe's home range? And then along with that, are there does that their home range doesn't include the feeders in those areas? And so are there does that you never see and the bucks that visit them, you won't see them also?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the average doe home range, I would put it at a couple 100 acres, 300 acres, somewhere in there. So much smaller than the bucks. And the doe's home ranges don't change a lot with the rut. I'm trying to think. Really, the only observations I have on whether there's some does that don't come to feeders. Well, yeah, we've got a couple 3 data sets that would suggest that there are indeed does that don't come to feed sites, and the proportion of those is going to depend on on the forage quality and the density of feed sites and things like that. But yes, there are does that won't come to feed sites, and so you're not going to see those does if if you're basing your trail camera surveys and blind observations and things like that around the feed sites. And yeah, there's going to be a buck and probably more than one buck that are going to be interested in those does in breeding when those does become receptive. So those bucks would would be visiting the area where those does hang out, even those does that don't come to feed sites. I don't think that necessarily means that you're not going to see those bucks, because again, most of these bucks had 2 or more of these kind of focal points, and so those bucks are going to be moving around amongst those areas. And as long as you're looking around in some different areas of your lease or your ranch, there's certainly a chance that you'd come across those deer. So yeah, I guess that's what I'd have for that one.
Okay. Is there any good quote unquote recovery diet, either food plot or commercial feed, that you would suggest to make available in late January, early February to help get these bucks back up to weight?
Yeah, there's a couple of the feed companies that are starting to make kind of a winter type diet, and I think what they're doing largely is reducing the amount of protein in the diet. So, maybe getting it down to 12%, something like that. And that type of diet, I think, would have some value. And one reason I say that is if you get too much protein in a diet, a lot more than the animal's going to be able to make use of, there can be some kind of negative feedback. The animal might not feel quite as well after eating a diet like that. And so, a diet with some less protein might be more palatable, and the deer may be able to make fuller use of it. Anything you can do to have some good green, lush forage growing, whether that's a food plot or some whether they're burned areas or whatever, that type of stuff can be a real magnet for bucks post rut. And I think the reason is because it's real palatable, and those types of diets are usually high in digestible energy as well. And so that would be good. One other thing to do would be to keep the corn feeders running for a while, because corn is a high energy diet. And as long as the deer have plenty of other things to choose from, that the rest of your habitat's strong, then they'll mix that corn in with the rest of the stuff they're eating to kind of balance out their needs. And so I don't have a recommendation on a particular pelleted diet, but those would be some things to look at. One other thing, if you do have a cottonseed feeding program, there could be some advantages in getting it going again after the rut. A lot of people won't feed cottonseed during the rut because there's some potential of a chemical in the cottonseed affecting the buck's ability to produce sperm, which would be a really bad thing during the rut. So most people that feed cottonseed will take it away in say late September, October. So just to minimize any potential negative effects. But starting the cottonseed up again in February could be a really good kind of strategy to help these bucks recover. And the reason I say that is cottonseed has about 10 to 20% oil in it, and the oils are really high in energy. And so if your bucks are used to eating cottonseed, they've eaten it before, when you put it out again, I've heard a number of people say the bucks have responded pretty well to coming into that cottonseed again after the rut, and that might be another strategy to give them an option to put on as much body condition as they want to recover from the rut.
Okay. How much does the weather or moon play into the dates of the rut timing?
Yeah, really don't have any idea on that, and you know, the only way I could think of looking at it is what we had looked at before, is to see if the buck movements are related to the timing. If you had enough data over several years of conception dates, you know, you might be able to look at it that way as well. But yeah, without that type of data, I'm just not aware of any indication that the moon phases are influencing the timing of the rut.
Okay. We've got several questions on the question and answer side. I'm going through them. I think you've answered some of the questions with some of your other responses. This one says, in East Texas, we had a lot of acorns last year during the season, a lot of acorns, and the deer only came to feeders at night. Is there any strategy that can be used to keep the deer coming to the feeders during the day?
Yeah, the only thing I know about is, well, if you have a timed feeder, you can obviously set it up to help dictate when the deer are going to come in. A lot of places around here in South Texas where I work, is they'll just shut down the feeders, for a couple of months during the hunting season, and that's probably not a real detrimental thing from the deer's nutritional standpoint, in part because these bucks aren't eating a lot anyway. They've already, built up all their reserves before that, all their fat and body before that time period. The does could still potentially benefit from it, but if you've got acorns in the woods at that time, that's just going to be, that'll be what those deer will be eating, and they can get everything they need out of those acorns and the other forage around. So other than shutting the feeders down to try to keep those deer out foraging, in morning and the evening, I really don't have any other recommendations.
Okay. In South Texas, when do the bucks shed their antlers, and where would be the best place to find them?
So the shedding of antlers starts usually early March, and then by the end of March, almost all the bucks are shed. There'll be a few that'll shed earlier, particularly bucks that may be in poor condition, and there's a few that may still carry that will still carry their antlers into April, but 80 or 90% of them will be done by the end of March. So really March is the prime shedding time. In terms of finding them, some of the feed sites and fences around those can be places where, maybe because bucks are jumping over the fences to get in the feed sites and, bumping into things around those. That can be one place to look. Outside of that, I don't have a real good idea, and talking to seeing if you can bend the ear of people that do a lot of shed hunting, that would be the other place to get some of that information. I'm still just kind of in a wandering around randomly in the spring and bumping onto a shed here and there, so I don't have any good suggestions on other places to focus.
Okay, and then back to home ranges. Do the bucks always come back to their home range, or do sometimes they remain outside of that original home range and establish a new range?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So the answer to that depends on the age of the buck largely. There's a relatively high proportion of the yearling bucks that will disperse and leave the home range that they had during the summer and fall. They'll leave that kind of as the rut starts up. And by a large percentage, I mean, 60, 70% of those yearling bucks will leave the home range that they were in the fall, and they'll go to a new home range, and they won't come back. And so it's a true dispersal movement. They've left their kind of natal area, or at least the area they were during the fall of their yearling year, and they'll set up a new home range. A lot of that, let's say 30 or so % of those yearling bucks that don't disperse as yearlings, most of them will then disperse as 2-year-olds. So they'll leave their area and set up a new home range the next breeding season when they're 2 years old. And so, it's kind of nature's way, I guess, of making sure that a buck offspring doesn't breed with his mom or sister or something like that. It's a way of keeping kind of the genetic pool mixed up within a local area. So these yearling and 2-year-old bucks will disperse. Of the mature bucks, it's a lot less common for a deer to pick up, move to a new home range, and not come back. I am aware of some situations, and kind of like that buck that I showed the movements of in the presentation, of bucks that may even move somewhere else for the rut and then come back to their home range. Our data would suggest that's not real common, but like I said, there's a lot of different individual strategies amongst these bucks, and there are some that that apparently mature bucks have a place that they really like to go for breeding, but then another place they like to hang out during the rest of the year. And so that type of thing can happen. But if you're talking about the proportion of deer that kind of disperse, that leave an area and never come back to it, that's primarily going to be yearling and 2-year-old bucks, and it would be much rarer in adult bucks.
Okay. And I think the last question that we had, I found a doe fawn 2 days ago that was being chased by 2 bucks. Does being bred this late and giving birth late cause complications or have an impact on the survival of the fawn?
Yeah, it would. So down here in South Texas, there's still a fair number of does being bred. So we're kind of on the tail end, so it's not real late. But other places in the state, yeah, that's going to be real late, and that fawn's going to be born in August sometime. And you'll see fawns even being born even later than that. So there's some long tails on that distribution of kind of breeding dates. There's a couple of implications. Most of those late bred does are probably doe fawns, back to the question that someone asked about when a doe could first be bred. So that doe may be 6 months old or something. We've got a fair amount of data now out of a couple of research projects that suggest that those doe fawns that get bred rarely raise their fawns. And part of it may be because they're dropping their fawns pretty late. And there's some problems with that. One of which is any doe that drops her fawn when all the other does are having their fawns, it's a lot harder for predators to find her particular fawn because there's a lot of fawns out there. And so it's kind of a predator swamping strategy is a term that they'll use in the wildlife biology field. These deer will try to all have their fawns at a similar time so that there's just too many fawns for the predators to eat, and a fair number of those fawns will live then. These little or these does that are being bred late, they're going to have their fawn at a time when there aren't many other young fawns around. And so the predators could really kind of key in, and there'd be a higher chance of them finding that that one real newborn fawn in amongst all the the fawns that were born a month ago that are all up and running around and able to get away from predators pretty readily. Another potential drawback of being born too late is the range conditions may not be really good, and particularly may not be good when that fawn is going to be weaned. And so maybe you miss that period of fall rains when that fawn's going to be weaned, and if it's going to be weaned in November, again, depending on where you are, there may have been some frost go through. The food may not be real good for a little tiny fawn who's just kind of being weaned off of mom's milk and having to start foraging on its own. And so that would be another potential disadvantage of being a late-born fawn. That having been said, I mean, some of those will live, but I think the deck's stacked against them if they're born outside of the time when a great majority of the fawns are born.
Okay. I think that wraps up our questions. I'll give it just 1 second. It's 1 o'clock now, so we may wrap it up. Just wanted to remind everybody that the next Wildlife for Lunch webinar is going to be on urban wildlife, presented by Jessica Alderson with Texas Parks and Wildlife, and that's going to be February the 19th. As a reminder, you can view this and all of the other previous webinars. I will post a link up in the chat window right now. if you want to go back and watch this webinar again, give me a week or so to get it posted up, and you can go back and watch it on YouTube, as well as all of our other archived webinars. So with that, Dr. Hewitt, unless you have anything else, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And
nope.
I appreciate the information. As always, it was extremely good and be a great resource to have.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I appreciate everybody's attention and interest.